I'd like to introduce Tim Westergren, the founder and former CEO of Pandora. Pandora Radio is a music streaming and automated music recommendation internet radio service. Pandora had a $1.5 billion revenue in 2017, serving 70 million users every month. Tim spent 17 years building the business from inception through its early years as a public company, and now he is an investment partner at Khosla Ventures. And interviewing Tim will be Bill Reichert, a partner at Pegasus Tech Ventures and managing director of Garage Venture Partners. Bill has over 30 years of experience as an investor, entrepreneur, and operating executive. Please help me in giving a warm welcome to Tim and Bill.
All right. Okay. Are we on? Great. Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you so much. So it is my great pleasure and delight to have the opportunity to chat here with Tim Westergren. I met Tim almost 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago when Tim was starting up Pandora. So we're going to talk a little bit about that journey this morning. So Tim, you were a student at Stanford, right? Uh-huh. And so what possessed you to start up Pandora?
Well, so a bunch of life experiences led to the actual idea. I'd been a musician since I was a young age, and after leaving college, I spent about 12 years trying to make a living at it. Partly as a performing musician, lived out of a van for a while, played live shows, and was part of the working musician's world. And then I transitioned into being a film composer. And as a film composer, I really started to think about and sort of study the notion of music taste, and kind of why people like what they like and how music works, and develop this sort of notion of the taxonomy of taste, the taxonomy of music. And had this idea in my head, a sort of latent idea in my head, and I was living in the Bay Area in 1999 when things were going berserk. And if you had any kind of idea that was in any way interesting, it was a time when you could get funding.
Right, any VC would throw money at you, right?
Pretty much. I mean, the idea was a very harebrained idea, which was sort of analyzing music and building this music genome project and developing a recommendation engine. And I just shared it with a friend of mine, and who said, let's see if we can't go raise some angel financing. I didn't even know what angel financing was at the time. But we wrote a business plan, and literally 6 weeks later, we had $1.5 million, part of it from Garage, and we were off to the races.
So it was, the timing was interesting. So you came up with, it was a really interesting lesson for entrepreneurs, which is, this wasn't just sort of a music discovery technique or whatever. The big idea was you had come up with this idea that it was called the Music Genome Project. And right then was the heat of the Human Genome Project. And so immediately everybody thought, wow, that must be really cool, right? So that was a pretty interesting hook. Can you, a couple more sentences on what the Music Genome Project was?
Yeah, so as its name implies, it was a taxonomy. It's about 450 attributes. So these are really every granular detail that collectively describe a song. So we took melody and harmony and rhythm and form and instrumentation and voice and so on, and deconstructed those into these binary, like primary colors in a sense. And then hired musicians, ultimately a team of about 100, who took each song one by one and scored them along these attributes. So actually assigned numbers, values to these. That then created essentially a sort of a 450-dimensional universe, a searchable universe. And we could calculate musical proximity from one song to another based on these attributes. That was kind of the notion.
So I hesitate to ask the audience right now. I'm a little nervous about this, but how many of you guys are subscribers to Pandora? Come on. Yeah? And how many to Spotify? Okay, well, okay.
Okay, so you have to ask how many use it for free. I think our subscribers, how many free
well,
users
okay,
are there?
right, okay. But everybody, of course, has listened to Pandora, right? All right, okay, thank you. All right, good. Okay.
Actually, I mean, how many people here have used Pandora?
How can you not have?
Okay.
Well, okay, if you're in some corner of the world that you guys never got to.
Yes, that's for sure.
Which was another issue.
Yeah.
So, okay, I gotta at least bring this up. What was the original name for Pandora?
Savage Beast Technologies was the founding name.
So they come in with this name, Savage Beast Technologies, and they've invented the Music Genome Project, and it was like incredibly cool. So why did you change the name from Savage Beast to Pandora?
Well, when you build a consumer product, the name sort of takes on a different importance. And actually, the origin of Savage Beast is the William Congreve poem, "Music hath charms to soothe the savage breast."
Right.
So it had all sorts of connotations that weren't really appropriate for a consumer name. So yeah, when we decided, when we pivoted into this new product, we knew that name was not going to survive. The name was meant to attract attention at a time when there was a lot of activity.
Right.
That really was the primary purpose.
Yeah. Well, and you very much succeeded. Okay. So the Odyssey of Pandora, it was, shall we say, a bumpy road, right?
Yes, it was.
Is that fair? So, okay, explain. You started out as one thing, and then you had a couple of near-death experiences, right?
Yes.
and then you wind up, as this brilliant, brand. So how did you navigate through all of this? So you went through 2 downturns, right? So the bubble burst, that really was not good. And then crawling back up, and then you have the meltdown, so that's not very good. And then you get Spotify coming out of this, from nowhere. So how did you navigate all this?
Yeah, so it was bumpy and circuitous. So I mean, the sort of thumbnail narrative is we launched in January of 2000, raised our first round of financing in March of 2000, 2 weeks before everything went off a cliff. And we spent about a year building the prototype for the Music Genome Project, which actually was built in Microsoft Excel. And it was a demo of this recommendation engine. And a year in, we tested it for the first time and discovered that it actually worked. It was after all this effort, we had analyzed about 10,000 songs and built this algorithm to match songs. We hadn't figured out what the business would be yet, but we had built the core technology. And this is now, the world looks very different around us. The dot-com collapse is in full flight. And we had begun testing the waters for raising new money, and it was pretty clear that was not going to be easy. And so we knew we were going to have to make our money last. So we began this process of asking our employees to work for an ever smaller share of their salary in cash. So we gave them options instead of cash, and the portion of cash shrunk and shrunk until at about the end of 2001, we had stopped paying people altogether. Yeah. And we asked our employees to keep working for free, essentially. We called that salary deferral back then.
That's what the lawyers required you to call it.
Right? Yeah. It's actually illegal in California to do it. So we couldn't afford an attorney, so we didn't know we were breaking the law, which is actually probably for the better. But about 50 people work without getting paid for 2 years to survive this, what really was that crater. And we outlasted the dot-com collapse because a company is relatively inexpensive to run when you don't pay anybody. So you can last longer than your average startup. And at the end of 2003, so we had deferred almost $2 million of salary. I had 11 maxed out credit cards. I think I owed about $300,000 or $400,000 of personal debt to people. We were being sued by 5 employees for having not paid them, and we were guilty of it. So it was a pretty stressful time. And on my 348th pitch to a venture fund, we got our Series A, our venture capital Series A. And that was, essentially got resuscitated in March of 2004.
Now, I want to say that was Larry and Larry. Was that?
It was.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So Walden and Labrador, right?
Right. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. God bless those guys.
Yes.
Right? God bless those guys. So okay. Meanwhile, okay, back in the technology front. I mean, so this was really very interesting. You know, this idea that you could deconstruct music into these 450 attributes, so you could listen to this singer and then hear the next song from somebody you'd never heard of before. So back then, and you know, everybody thought, oh well, computers can do that, can't they?
Yeah.
And we were anxious about, my God, there's a lot of songs. How can you let human labor do this?
Yeah.
But you made the comment that there are only a relatively small number of songs that matter.
Yeah.
So I mean, it was something like there have only been 32,000 songs that have ever been on the charts in the history of the charts or something. I'm sure it's bigger now. But so it was a reasonable thing to do. So how is the technology progressing through all of this, and are you still doing it all manually through this whole period?
Yeah, so it is counterintuitive in this world to do something like that, to have people actually sit down. It took what we called music analysts about half an hour to analyze the simplest of pop songs. And it could take over an hour for a symphonic piece, which seems insane. And that's why it took me 348 pitches to raise financing, because when I showed someone this methodology, they would just laugh at it. But like you said, the reality is that there really is a relatively small portion of the catalog that constitutes the vast majority of listening. It's one of the great sort of problems with music. But so it's a smaller problem than the 50 million songs that people think about. And the second thing is you just do that once. And you don't have to keep doing it. So it turned out that it really was, I think, the right approach. And because it did two things that kind of in our opinion were kind of the core problem with music on the web. The first one was what you call the cold start problem. So when a consumer comes to a service for the first time and enters some form of information to launch an experience, before you know anything about them, it's very hard to pick the right songs. And you fail mostly, and people are not forgiving. You know, if you say, hey, come to this music service and we'll play you songs you love, if you don't deliver on that, they're gone. And the Music Genome Project allowed us to nail that without any data, just because we knew the sound of the music. So that was the first thing. And the second thing was, it was and remains the only recommendation engine in the world that is blind to popularity. So when the...
Wild applause? Did I hear wild applause?
Essentially,
that's good. Thank you.
Recommendations on the web are one or other form of collaborative filtering, which is essentially, if you like product A, the technology looks at everybody else who likes product A and what is the next most popular product, and they recommend that.
Right.
What that does is rewards popularity, and it leaves everything else with no access. And in music, that is the cornerstone of the problem. You know, the sea of working artists, which I had been among for many, many years, never get to be in those engines, and so it's the rich get richer. And the genome was the one way to solve that, and that was really the origin of the idea. You know, how can you take someone who knows, everybody knows Bruce Springsteen, but how do you use that as a doorway to discovering other Bruce Springsteens that no one knows about? And that, to this day, remains, I think, one of Pandora's core differentiators, is you discover stuff there.
And it's also a mission at some level.
Absolutely,
for you.
100%.
You know, that was part of what drove you. So, you know, sort of the amazing thing about Pandora and Tim is, you know, I've seen hundreds of companies over the years. Tim and Pandora represent sort of the ultimate entrepreneurial persistence, resilience, passion to see it through to an IPO. I mean, that was unbelievable. So, but before you were able to go public, you had to pivot a few times to get to a model that made some sense.
Yeah.
So kind of tell us kind of where you started and how you evolved into a business model that, you know, made sense.
Yeah, so the first part, the first chapter was we were a technology licensing company. We imagined ourselves being an ingredient technology that other people would use to navigate their catalogs, like a recommendation engine. That lasted about 4.5 years. Those are the really trying times. Then we recognized this opportunity to go after radio and repurpose that same IP to build personalized playlists. It was a very natural fit. And we actually initially launched that believing that it would be a subscription product. So when Pandora very first launched, you would get 10 hours of listening for free, and then you had to give credit card and sign up, and nobody signed up. So people listened for 10 hours, they would log off, erase their cookies, and get like a new 10-hour batch, and no one was paying for it. So we had a choice
There's
to
some
make.
guilty people out here, I can tell.
We had a choice to make. Do we keep trying to sort of grind that subscription business, or do we go free? And that was the second branch or third, I guess, fork in the road, and we decided to go free, not knowing whether that would be viable, because in radio, you pay every time you stream a piece of music. It's a fraction of a penny, but it adds up in a hurry. Yeah. So you grow, and you've got to build an advertising business on top of that. And this had never been done before. So we were essentially inviting an enormous expense by letting this thing grow, and it was growing fast, not knowing if we could catch up to it.
Right.
And so that took us, we did.
Right.
And that was a 10-year, really extraordinary, euphoric run, growing from 0 to 100 million listeners without a dime of marketing, over $1 billion in revenue, and that was really an amazing. And then the final chapter, like the next chapter, was the decision to add a subscription, like a full-blown subscription product.
Yeah. So, but initially, so now, do you get credit for inventing internet radio?
I think we were not the first internet radio, but I think Pandora was the first to really mainstream streaming.
Yeah.
In the consumer mind.
And so initially, a huge problem was this license fee thing. Yeah. So you guys, I think I can say this publicly. You got negative gross margins for a while.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No. It was upside down.
So you would, you'd lose 5 cents on every song you stream, but you made it up in volume, right?
Yeah, right.
One of those. So you had to negotiate with the world a new licensing model for streaming radio. Fair? Is that?
Yeah. So there were two domains. When we were a radio product, we operated under a statutory federal license. So it's actually kind of a single license you can avail yourself of without ever talking directly to the rights holders themselves, so labels and artists and publishers. And that license fee is set by the Copyright Office. Right. Every 5 years, a 3-judge arbitration panel essentially determines the fate of the entire industry by ruling on sort of a 5-year rate. And actually, one of the near-death experiences we had was with that, because in 2007 or 8, the panel published its ruling, and I still remember where I was when it happened, that it tripled the rate. And it was a really misguided reading of the business and the industry, and it was just a terrible ruling. But overnight,
the industry was incredibly ticked off at all the piracy and Napster and Kazaa, and they were, and so they were lobbying for this incredible rate, and that would have killed you, right?
Yeah. And so we were ready to pull the plug on the product altogether. Yeah. We had a board meeting the next day. And the discussion was, how soon do we shut down? Because all we're doing now is burning money. Yeah. And instead of doing that, we decided to see if we couldn't get Congress to intervene and get this rate fixed.
Wow.
Like get an act of Congress. And we talked to a bunch of people that were in the business of lobbying, all said that's a fool's errand, like don't bother. There's just no way that Congress will care, and even if they did, it would take way too long. But nonetheless, we went ahead and we launched a campaign. We emailed all of our listeners. It was a personal email that came from me, and it essentially told this story of this is what has happened to the rates. Pandora's going to go dark, and unless we get some kind of groundswell of support, and if you're willing to help, please call your member of Congress. And because when people register, they provide their zip code, we could say, and here's their name and phone number, and fax number, or their office if you're inclined to go visit them. And the response from the audience was just extraordinary. We had, the estimate is about 2 million people called, wrote, faxed, or visited their members' offices. Right. And literally for a couple weeks, every phone in every Senate and congressional office was ringing from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. with Pandora listeners calling to complain. They got more calls on this than they got in the entirety of the Iraq War.
Wow.
Which is kind of fucked up. But
unbelievable story.
Yeah, and it was the popular uprising was sort of so intense that Congress intervened. So a senior member of the Senate and the House summoned us to DC and brought us, other internet radio companies, and the labels around in a room and essentially said, something has clearly gone wrong here. You need to get back in a room and figure it out, and if you don't, we're going to pass a law, which scared the crap out of the music industry. And so we spent a year under congressional supervision redrawing the rates. So it's a long digression, but that was the statutory license. Then we went into subscription. And when you go into subscription where you offer a much more interactivity, you have to license directly. And that is a very painful label by label, publisher by publisher negotiation.
So you did cross over into subscription.
We did, yeah.
Just a few minutes before you went public, I guess. That was part of it.
No, later.
But, so you went public June 11, June 15, 2011. I remember the day. And I tell people Pandora was an 11-year overnight success. So what went into the decision to go public?
So we had been around for 11 years, and the truth is that we'd had a lot of investors that had supported the company and been there for a while, including Larry and Larry, and we're 7 years into it. And it was time to, I think about rewarding people that had invested in the company. We weren't quite ready to really be public, I would say, in hindsight.
Interesting.
Although I'm not sure we would have been more ready a year later. It was kind of a gamble, but it seemed I think we all came to the conclusion that it was time to get some liquidity for people and make this a public company, and that might allow us room to maneuver to raise more financing, to expand, to make acquisitions, to sort of be more expansive in our vision. So it was kind of a handful of things that lined up to lead to that.
So you did launch subscription, but overwhelmingly it was advertising, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Right. So the subscription did not quite work for Pandora.
Yeah.
But then these guys out of Sweden show up. And so how did you think about Spotify as they were sort of barreling into the market?
Well, it's funny. I mean, it's the classic innovator's dilemma. Ironically, we fell victim to it. It's funny because I actually lectured in Clay Christensen's class at Harvard years ago, and I lectured, and part of what I talked about was the failing of the broadcast radio industry to respond to internet radio. And what happened to us was we had this, we had in this 10-year period, we had seen this astonishing growth, and the usage of we were like 10% of every radio hour was on Pandora by that point. And it was hard not to feel very bullish about where that was going. And our experience in the world of licensing had been so adversarial that we couldn't conceive that there was a way to have an actual mutually beneficial relationship there. So we had some sacred cows, and we took too long to kind of say, you know what, we have to take a chance and break what we're doing and rebuild it. And it's a very hard thing, even for a young company that we were, to do that. And we just did it too late.
So, Drat, so we're running out of time here, unfortunately. But so you then eventually took over as CEO of Pandora. What's it like running a public company compared to, public company with a lot of cash in the bank versus a private company with no cash in the bank? That's a pretty wide swing.
I had last been CEO in 2004 when we were 70 people. And we're not even Pandora in name or in product. And then I stepped back in because the company was really struggling. We were 2,500 employees with 50 offices and over $1 billion in revenue. But our stock had really taken a tumble. We had an activist in the stock, a Carl Icahn protege. And it was not it was a challenging time,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
even by public company standards. So it was a battle for a couple of years, and I tried to come in and sort of restart and sort of redraw the vision, but it was really hard. It's very hard to maneuver when you're a public company, especially when your stock is down, because you're kind of, you get boxed in by the sort of pressures of public market investors and activists. So that was a time when we wish we were private for sure. We would have been able to do things, but it was tough.
Yeah. So, okay, so what next for Tim Westergren? So, you know, you've proven that you can change the world. I mean, literally, really. I mean, there are very few people on, you know, in this planet who have made such an impact, you know, sort of up and down the sort of the stack. Now what? Now what are you going to do?
Well, I think about it a couple ways. In music, my work is not done, because the part of the vision that I really wanted to see come true was to create a musician's middle class. So how do you harness technology and these sort of systems at scale to allow this layer of really deserving artists to, you know, make a living at what they do? And that should exist. And we were on our way to doing that, but once we became public, I think other pressures subverted some of that. So I still want to see that come true. I'd like to find a way to do that. Okay. And you know, I do love consumer products, and I'm looking at them from an investor standpoint, but I certainly imagine finding another thing to do.
Okay, so you're not just going to sit back and be one of those lazy investor types, right?
I have the itch still.
You're going to, all right. Tim, thank you so much. That was really great. Thank you. So now I think we've got,
Wow. Thank you, Tim and Bill, for that incredible conversation. So many powerful pieces of wisdom, especially on how to do something that's never been done before, and the resilience and the creativity it takes to do so. The Startup World Cup team would now like to give Tim a special token of our appreciation.
I think she's coming. Here she comes. Okay. Thank you. So,
Thank you.
and Tim, all right. And we're going to do a photo opportunity? Okay. Thank you.